Hello, thanks so much for joining our presentation today. My name is Dr. Catherine Atria, and I am a professor of educational practice in the Department of Educational Leadership in the College of Education at the University of Florida.
Hi, I'm Dr. Elizabeth Washington, professor and coordinator of secondary education and social studies education in the School of Teaching and Learning, College of Education, University of Florida.
Hi, my name is Christina Aulino. I'm a graduate assistant at the College of Education in the School of Teaching and Learning.
Hi, I'm Dr. John Rehm. I'm the curriculum specialist for social studies for Alachua County Public Schools.
Hi, my name is Jordan Marlin. I've really been a part of this project in two ways. First, I serve as the mayor in the city of Newberry here in the state of Florida. And I'm also a teacher of this curriculum. I had the opportunity to teach this at Newberry High School. I was part of the pilot. So it's my honor and my pleasure to bring you this presentation that really is hopefully going to help you understand how we got here today. Before we start this presentation, I want to be clear that there are some graphic images as part of this presentation. These conversations are hard and they require us to really look at history with a raw lens. And with that, I'd like to get started. Now, our challenge in this curriculum has really been, how do we tell this history? How do we tell this, how do we have these hard conversations in a way that don't just teach about the history, but also teach about where we are today in 2021 in our country. We all know that we're living in some turbulent times when it comes to race, and these conversations cause some strong emotions. So this project, this curriculum, from start to finish, it's always been about how do we pull these lessons from the past, not just as lessons from the past, but how do we create lessons for us that we can give our students to take into their understanding of the conversations, the news reports, the society that they find themselves living in today. The Newberry lynchings, commonly referred to as the Newberry Six, we've been trying to change that nomenclature because we know that there were more than 6 victims that were murdered that day. Happened on August 18th in 1916. Until now, it has never been collectively addressed as a community, in my city of Newberry. We're seeking to change that. We really want to address this. We want to pull everyone in our community together and have this conversation. It has national implications, but for me as mayor, it has implications in my own backyard. I want my whole town to feel like they can come together and have these conversations. I don't want anyone to feel like they're not a part of our community, and I don't want anybody to feel like they have to keep secrets. One example that we tried to pull into this curriculum is giving our students an understanding of some similarities in the narratives when it comes to the history of lynching, the history of Jim Crow era America. As you can see in our own story, it happened with a man named Boise Long, who, and this is straight from the Wikipedia webpage, and by the way, actually my class who originally taught this, we tried to work with Wikipedia to change this language. We were unsuccessful. Maybe this year's class will try again to change this language because I think it's an important change to make. But as you see in our story, right off the bat, it begins by accusing Boise Long. It begins by highlighting the fact that the sheriff was there to serve a warrant on Boise Long for a suspicion of stealing hogs. Now, if you know anything about the South, you know that everyone had hogs. Hogs were the most inexpensive animal, livestock to raise. So the farmer in me already has some suspicions about this Wikipedia story. But I think it's important that our kids know that these stories, these narratives of lynchings, they almost universally begin with an accusation of some petty crime or an accusation made by a white woman of some impropriety made by an African-American male. So this is the Wikipedia page, and this is a headline from a newspaper article about a contemporary issue going on in the Ahmaud Arbery case. And again, as we see in the Ahmaud Arbery case, almost every headline, almost every news story began that story by casting Ahmaud Arbery as someone who was suspected of carjacking. I heard carjacking, I heard burglaries. There was one moment where the headline ran for an entire day and it showed a video clip of him walking into a house that was under construction. He was there for about 10 seconds and then he left. But the narrative is the same. Boise Long, a man suspected of hog stealing. Ahmaud Arbery, a man suspected of burglaries, carjackings, what have you. They all start that way, and it's important that our students see that, because once we see that, once the kids get that, now you can't get that over on them again. You can't pull the wool over their eyes. They're always looking for that verbiage. They're looking for that intro, that hook, and they become suspect to it. We also think it's really important to note that the defendants in this case are using a Jim Crow era law that was passed in Georgia right after the Civil War that gave men, white men who had the right to vote, the power to make citizens arrest. It's really interesting, unfortunately interesting, that right here in 2021, we're still using a Jim Crow era law in the defense of 3 white men accused of murdering a black man. These are the kinds of trends, these are the kinds of characteristics that we're trying to get our students to see. We want them to actively look for these connections and make these connections and ask critical questions about all of these cases. And that's the goal of this curriculum. Again, it's not just to teach the history lesson, it's to show how history is currently repeating itself and allow the students to be empowered to pull those connections out on their own, absent a teacher helping them or guiding them. When I first taught about the Newberry lynchings in the city of Newberry in my classroom, it was without this curriculum. It was a much less structured moment. And it was a very impactful day for me. I'll never forget it, because as I was teaching this history, about halfway through the lesson, one of my students raised their hand and she said, oh, I'm a descendant of one of the people who were murdered that day. And I said, oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I should have asked that question ahead of time. And then another young woman who was sitting literally right next to her in the adjoining row said, yes, Mr. Marlowe, I'm a descendant of one of the victimizers. So in the city of Newberry, in my classroom, I was confronted in that moment with one young woman who was a descendant of the state senator who was pictured, or is pictured in this. And I had a woman sitting right next to her, a young woman sitting right next to her, who was a descendant of the victims. And that was poor planning on my part, and it's one of the reasons I'm so grateful to the University of Florida for making this partnership so that we can do a better job of teaching this history. But in my community, this isn't history, it's present. We're living this right now. We have descendants of both victim and victimizer in our midst, and they really need this curriculum. They need to be taught this in a formalized way so that they can have these hard conversations in an appropriate setting, in an appropriate way that is guided, that is structured, and gives them the ability to draw some lessons from it. And hopefully it gives them the ability to reach across that aisle and hold hands and go into the future together with a better understanding of where each person is coming from and their history when we have an Ahmaud Arbery type situation in America. We're all coming from different places, and conversations and curriculum like this help us go into those conversations with a better understanding of where we all are. Another trend that is very common in lynching stories is an oath of silence. In the city of Newberry, all of the 200 mob who showed up to murder 6 people on August 18th, they touched the rope that the people were hanging from, and they took an oath of silence. That oath of silence lasted for about 100 years. I remember sitting in my grandparents' kitchen, and they had company over. They had forgotten that their little 6-year-old grandson was sitting in the kitchen with them. And they brought up the Newberry lynchings, and they got about 2 or 3 comments in before my grandmother remembered I was there. And she shushed everybody, and everyone in the room immediately segued into a different topic and acted like they hadn't been speaking about anything of import. And in fact, if they had kept talking, I would have known that it was important. I only knew it was important because that oath of silence sort of kicked in. That's not an uncommon trait. It's something that when you study lynching stories, you will hear this. One of the things that is in this curriculum that your students will learn if you teach it to them is that someone was lynched every 4 days in Jim Crow era America. A black person was lynched every 4 days in Jim Crow era America. And that doesn't count the people who were murdered officially by the state. Boise Long is not officially a victim of the Newberry lynchings because he had a trial. His jury went out for 6 minutes, decided that he was guilty, and then he was executed in the city of Gainesville, which is a few miles to the east of the city of Newberry. So part of this curriculum, part of what we're trying to do in the city of Newberry is break that oath of silence. We're trying to bring this story into the light so that we can all confront it, we can all address it, we can all try to heal and move forward. Our motto in the city of Newberry is embracing the past and enhancing the future. I think that we have failed in the first part of that motto. We have not embraced our full past, and until we embrace our full past, it's going to be impossible for us to move forward and think about enhancing the future.
So in 2017, the city of Newberry began engaging in the Truth and Reconciliation process. I know Mr. Marlowe as a teacher and a mayor in the city of Newberry. When he first began his teaching career, I served as his assistant principal and very quickly came to know him as a very compassionate and dedicated educator who was very interested in ensuring that students fully understood the history of the U.S. as well as their local history and the ways in which it impacts them today and in their future. So through our conversations, Mr. Marlowe and me, the goal was always to create public spaces for sincere and truthful conversations about race and an effort to really know how to think about the safest way and most comfortable way, if you will, to approach the reconciliation process. Throughout our conversations, the focus was always on education in the classroom, right from the very beginning. So moving into 2018, I offered to assist in Newberry's effort through a newspaper article. I opened up the newspaper one Sunday morning and the Truth and Reconciliation process and Mr. Marlowe's name was in the article related to the work that he was doing. And I reached out immediately and said, hey, Jordan, what can I do to help in this endeavor? So of course, Mr. Marlowe being who he is, immediately responded and we brainstormed some ways, and that was really our first step in the journey towards bringing the history into the classroom. One of the very first things we did was engage in a conversation, if you will, with the city of Newberry, bringing together both the descendants of the victims and the descendants of the victimizers, and approaching that conversation from a historical perspective as well as how people were feeling currently present day. I then reached out to Dr. Washington as a colleague at the University of Florida and asked about her interest in creating a curriculum and working with Alachua County Public Schools. It was also through a conference that I had organized at UF, the Imperative for Social Justice Conference in Education, that I met Dr. Rehm. And as the coordinator for social studies education at Alachua County Public Schools, he approached me after a presentation and we engaged in conversation about what work we could do together on this project. So with Dr. Rehm's input, Dr. Washington's input, and Mr. Marlowe's very dedicated work in Newberry, the process began. In the 2021 school year, 7 of the high school teachers in Alachua County who teach African American history were approached regarding their interest in piloting the curriculum that Dr. Washington put together, and 4 of those teachers agreed to participate. So I think at this time, what we will now hear is from a teacher and his reasons for participating in the project. And you will hear from Mr. Christopher Pearl.
My name is Christopher Pearl. I'm a teacher at Lofton High School, Alachua County. I teach U.S. history, world history, African American history. I'm also part of the Alachua County African American History Task Force. I'm making this video in order to promote the teaching of African American history in our curriculum in schools, not only here in Florida, but across the nation. I feel that it is very important for us to address issues in our nation's past with regard to African American history, and more specifically with regard to racial violence, in order to bring more understanding and learning among students and constructive discussion that will help us as a society as a whole. Our history is filled with much triumph and tragedy. And it is taught to today's youth as both an inspirational story and a cautionary tale as to where some choices and roads may lead us. We study history because times change, but human nature does not. And therefore, we analyze instances of oppression and of violence, such as 20th century Jews in Europe and Armenians in Anatolia, in order to recognize the prevailing mentality that plagues us with behavior patterns that enable human beings to normalize the dehumanization of our fellow man. This historical perspective makes sure that something like that never happens again. The reason why we learn history is just that so we don't forget, and we can apply the lessons from our history to modern day. In the United States, there are certain parts of our history that are often left out of the national conversation, either by design or because of their painful subject matter. The legacy of slavery, the history of racial violence, and the systematic oppression of African Americans would be an example of this. Present-day Americans aren't really quite sure how to deal with these issues. So oftentimes they're just ignored or not talked about in order to make everybody feel comfortable. But if we truly seek a better future with regard to race relations, then it is imperative that we educate our youth on these issues, on the real causes and effects of these tragedies. In the words of writer James Baldwin, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. This exercise is not intended to shame certain racial groups, but it is intended to discuss these issues in a constructive way so we can find a better way forward. If Americans want a society where everyone is judged by the content of their character and not the color of their skin, then we have to work towards that. As Dr. King suggested, we must reconcile these issues and their impact on our society. Then and only then we can begin to heal as a society and set a new course for a better future. We want the American dream to be a reality for anyone willing to work for it. Racism may be part of our past, but it does not have to be part of our future if we implement good education-based curriculums to deal with these issues.
I had some very engaging conversations with Mayor Marlowe and Dr. Atria about designing the curriculum, what our goals would be, and where we really wanted the focus to be, to talk about both the history of racial violence and to link that to current issues that seem to be the legacy of racial violence in the United States. The name of the unit that I designed is Racial Violence, Truth, and Reconciliation in U.S. History. And in this unit, students are asked to explore the legacy of lynching and racial violence that remains in order to examine why certain stories are told as official history and why other stories are ignored, and also to describe what truth and reconciliation really mean in the context of racial violence in the United States. A couple of key guiding questions that we had for the unit plan. What does it mean to say that something is a difficult topic in history and in current events? I would conceptualize this differently than I would say a controversial topic in history or current events. Difficult history and controversial history or current events are two different things. When you say that something is difficult, it means that, among other things, emotions are involved that can really get people either engaged or maybe feel alienated from the educational process. And we wanted this to be as engaging and inclusive as possible of all of the students that these teachers would be working with. So that was one of the guiding questions. Another one, why has there been such silence around anti-Black racial violence? Why talk about it now, and why does it matter? The curriculum first zooms out to the big picture of how white supremacists used the Jim Crow laws and terror tactics to systematically oppress Black people during the Jim Crow era. It focuses on how historical data has been collected, and disseminated to educate people about racial violence and to advocate for laws abolishing these different forms of racial violence and to memorialize the victims of the violence and the locations in which the violence took place. So after the zoom out, the curriculum then zooms in on the truth and reconciliation process in Newberry itself, as Dr. Atria and Mayor Marlowe were talking about at the beginning. Then the curriculum zooms out again with lessons on both systemic and individual forms of racism, including major recent and current events around the Black Lives Matter movement and the murders of numerous Black people by white law enforcement officers. In the unit, students are asked to do some pretty complex things, some things that are very difficult at times, but things that are very meaningful and relevant to this material that we want to take them through. We wanted students to learn about the definition of lynching. It's very important to start with that. A lot of students don't know what that means, and to talk about it in its historical context. Also, we wanted to get students to engage with this difficult knowledge that may invoke strong emotions and discomfort among students. We wanted students to be involved in setting the norms for classroom discussions so that an atmosphere of trust and respect and safety and honest critical inquiry could be established. And thanks to the participating teachers in the pilot, that was the challenge, and that was something that they did so well. We also wanted to focus on dialogue and on analysis of historical sources and contemporary sources, not focus on debate, dialogue, discussion, and analysis of the material that they were going to engage in. And we wanted students to be involved in a variety of opportunities to participate, from individual thinking to talking with partners, talking in small groups, and whole class discussion, engaging with all these different kinds of sources in order to analyze key events. And then we also wanted to give students an opportunity to share their interests and their concerns and to speak up about how this affected them on a personal level. So I'll talk a little bit about the different parts of the unit. First of all, in part one is called Understanding the History of Lynching and Racial Violence. Why did it happen? Where did it happen? And how did it happen? Part two is called Lynching and Racial Violence, Close to Home. And this is the part of the unit where we talked about the history of lynching in Florida and in Newberry. Mayor Marlowe and Dr. Atria have talked about Newberry specifically, but it's also important to know that for a certain time during the Jim Crow era, Florida had the highest number of lynchings among all of the former Confederate states. Part three of the unit is called Memorials, Truth, and Reconciliation, and that focuses very deeply on the truth and reconciliation process in Newberry itself, that Mayor Marlowe, Dr. Atria, and others in the community came together in a very strong, robust coalition to talk about how this would be memorialized. Part four is called Current Events and Issues Around Racism. And this included some very important content around the Black Lives Matter movement that has been a very powerful movement for several years now, but it certainly coalesced around the police murder of George Floyd in May 2020. So there were also issues connected to police brutality and other kinds of current events that have to do with violence against people of color and Black people in particular. Part five is called Contemplations, and this is where we wanted to get students to engage on a more personal level using song lyrics and quotes related to issues related to race. Part six is called Do Something, and this is where we wanted students to develop, for example, 5-point plans to address aspects of racism in everyday life and to consider how to be an anti-racist, not just a non-racist, but an anti-racist, someone who works actively to counteract some of the forces and attitudes and mentalities around racism. In this part of the unit, we weren't asking students to solve all of the problems of the world, but to think about things that they could focus on in their daily lives. Some key features of the unit plan that I'll just run through really quickly, some things that I took into consideration along with the teachers who were piloting in order to make sure that this could work as easily for the teachers as possible, even though this was difficult material for them to engage in as well. It's about 2 to 3 weeks of instruction, and I wrote detailed step-by-step lesson plans not so that the teachers would have a script to follow, but just kind of a flow of events that might make sense. And I wanted students and teachers to be able to use a wide array of primary and secondary sources and to use multiple forms of text and images. There were numerous reading and writing activities spread throughout the unit, both individual and group. The sources were modified for struggling readers. So, for example, if I came across a story from a newspaper, I would kind of edit the story, not to change the content, but just to sometimes make the vocabulary a little simpler and to make the reading shorter for students who were struggling readers. We also had journaling throughout the unit. We asked students to keep a journal starting at the beginning, and they were given prompts throughout the unit so that they could answer some questions and just write the answers for themselves, just to think about personally, but to share them if the opportunity arose. And then the unit also includes some ideas for final projects that students could do, such as the 5-point plan that I mentioned. The unit includes all of the handouts, the ancillary materials that students will need, and it includes a teacher guide for organizing the unit and for kind of setting the stage for what's going to be studied and how students are going to ask to be engaged in the unit plan. Also, we thought it would be a really good idea before we started anything to send a letter home to parents and to write a letter to students so that we could introduce the unit, explain the rationale for it, and explain what the goals would be, and to know who to contact if they had any concerns. So that was one of the first steps that we took. And just a note about the formatting, I was able to put all of the documents into Microsoft Word format so that teachers could download everything and modify them as they saw fit.
One of the crucial resources related to the Newberry lynchings is housed at the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program. Many citizens of Newberry contributed their recollections and insights regarding these events to the oral history archives at the University of Florida. SPOP's mission is to gather, preserve, and promote living histories of individuals from all walks of life, and they consult with local historians, civic leaders, and educators in Florida who are interested in initiating oral history projects. SPOP hosts lectures and workshops at the University of Florida and around the country to engage scholars in the use of oral history and in using the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program's collections. You can find more information about the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program at oral.history.ufl.edu.
So when I came in, I got really lucky because as someone who's in charge of social studies for a school district, it's my job to create and then disseminate a social studies curriculum. In this case, I had a social studies curriculum dropped in my lap. Not only did I have a curriculum dropped in my lap, I had a really good curriculum dropped in my lap. So our first goal was to make sure that we were going to pilot this program, which we did and you've heard about so far. So now our goal as a school district is to expand the usage of this curriculum to other courses. We decided to pilot the curriculum in the African and African American history courses because it is an elective, and therefore we knew we didn't have to follow any course guidelines that would end in an end-of-year exam or anything like that that the state had. So our goal now then is to expand it into those courses that are the core courses of social studies where there might be an end-of-year exam. The idea would be that teachers can use all or parts of this curriculum in what they are doing when they are teaching about Jim Crow era, when they're teaching about civil rights era, when they're teaching about lynchings, et cetera. So we're trying to start working with teachers in other courses and do some training along those lines so that they have a better grasp of what's in the unit and how they can use it within their courses. We're also working with the Oral History Project so that we can get more material for teachers to use from a variety of local sources, not just from the Newberry lynchings, but from other things throughout Alachua County, in Gainesville, in Archer, and some other cities there. We are also trying to share this with teachers throughout the state of Florida. And so I've been in contact with other social studies supervisors throughout the state of Florida and enlightening them on the existence of this curriculum, what it's about, and how they could use it and adapt it to what they have and to the history that they have within their own communities, so that the elements of racial violence and teaching about that can be used at the same time that they are teaching about their own local history of racial violence within their communities. So as we're spreading this to the state of Florida, we thought we could also spread this nationwide. And so that's why we're here today presenting to you, because this curriculum isn't just about Newberry, it's about racial violence. And so we can offer this curriculum to you as well to use anywhere in the country with your own local resources. If you would like to use this, or for any additional information, please feel free to contact any one of us at any time. If you would like the curriculum in particular, please reach out to Dr. Washington and she will send you a copy of the curriculum. Thank you so much for attending today, and we'll be answering any questions you have in just a moment.
So in order for the city of Newberry to truly embrace that motto, we're engaged in this work, and that's why we're coming to you today. And I would like to take this moment to just express my eternal gratitude to all of the people who have been part of this project. Without them, we would not be able to take this story to the Alachua County. We'd not be able to take this story to the state of Florida. We would not be able to bring this story to you. We wouldn't be able to bring this history to you today. I couldn't have done it alone, and I truly appreciate every single person, and I truly appreciate you being in the audience listening to this presentation, and I hope you take this curriculum and you implement it at your home as well.